Today we're looking at an overview of some of the key parts of the history of the fracturing of Joseph Smith's church. Because there's more than one Mormon church, so where did they come from? And this is only a handful of some of the larger groups. It should be known to start off with that there are many more that are not represented, but equally have a right to be considered Mormons and shouldn't be ignored. So the church was started right here in 1830 by Joseph Smith. Now it really began before that, but it was officially organized then. And he had a ministry that lasted until his death in 1844. Now, we should note that even before his death, there were people that were breaking away from his church, notably David Whitmer. And so we have him represented here sometime prior to his death, and his followers continuing to this day. And we're not going to talk about numbers necessarily, because numbers have never really factored into whether to a church's authenticity claims. It's specifically told in the Book of Mormon not to do so. Many are called, but few are chosen. So the true followers of Christ in Mormonism will never be reckoned by who has the largest church. So we're not going to look at that, but we will look at the timelines, and we will look at when they broke off. Now, David Whitmer was before Joseph died. He, among others, had believed that Joseph had fallen into sin. And that's important because Joseph was told several times that he could sin, and if he did sin, he would lose the prophetic oracles, but that he would ordain someone to replace him. But of course, various people have ways of interpreting this. So some people had problems with Joseph Smith and decided that perhaps he was not being inspired to make some of the current changes, and they wanted to stay with what was expressed in a previous iteration of the church. Joseph Smith's church was unfolding, understand, that he was learning line upon line, precept upon precept, as it says in Scripture, and the church was evolving, and it should, because it's shaking off the belief systems of the apostasy, which is some truth and some non-truth, and that's a process. So we can expect that all of us learn line upon line, precept upon precept, prophets included, as it says even of Jesus that he received grace upon grace. So he grew. So all of them grow. So it's natural for some people to think perhaps the prophet, I can't trust him anymore. I'm going to stick with what he's revealed previously. So David Whitmer did not renounce his belief that Joseph was a prophet, but he thought that Joseph had fallen in some way, and he was going to stay true to an earlier message. At 1844, James Strang immediately produced a letter from Joseph Smith that has been authenticated by at least some experts, and he claimed to lead the church as the president of the church to succeed Joseph, and he did so immediately upon Joseph's death. I'm not going to continue the same line as we got coming down, showing that there are some changes, but there weren't very drastic changes in the church, either the church structure or beliefs, at least not right away. James continued to evolve his church over his 12-year ministry based on new revelations. So that is to be expected. Now, over here we have Brigham Young. Brigham Young did not lead his group right away. He didn't claim to. As a matter of fact, he didn't say he was a prophet. He said he was not a prophet. And he published that in the Times and Seasons. For 3 years, or at least 3 years, he had said that he was kind of a placeholder and temporary guardian of the church, and And the people who followed him weren't following him as a leader of the church, but they were waiting for the announcement of a new prophet. And many people expected that Joseph III would be that prophet, and that Brigham Young would maybe take some guardianship of the church and of Joseph III until he could lead. So it wasn't until 1847 that Brigham Young announced that he was going to be moving into the first presidency, and that was not an uncontroversial move. Some people left immediately because they thought that was in error. So James Strang continued. He continued his church for up until in 1849 he began to practice polygamy. I think it really came out in 1850. At that point, several people who were opposed to, who favored James Strang, who believed that he was a prophet or were part of his church, broke off from him, either believing that he was a false prophet or a fallen prophet. And some of those, by the name of Jason Briggs and Zenas Gurley, broke off, and they began, I call this the proto-RLDS because they didn't officially start the church yet, but they were working on it. And so this period from about 1850 to 1860, they were gathering support, trying to stay true to Joseph's church, renouncing James's polygamy, gathering people. Some of the people they gathered still believed James was a prophet, but maybe fallen into sin because of the polygamy. Around the same time, about 1852, Brigham Young was officially coming out as polygamist, although it had been widely suspected prior to that. There was a lot of evidence and a lot of controversy. The way that James practiced it and Brigham practiced it are very different. Brigham Young was out to get as many wives as he can. He had 55. James had 5, and that was an exception even. The next Strangite that had as many wives was 3 wives, and there was only maybe a couple that had that, and a few people that had 2, and by far most of the Strangites were monogamous. It was definitely not something that they had to do. It was just an option with biblical precedent. So in 1860, when Joseph died, Joseph's son, Joseph III, he was only 11 years old. So by the time he chooses a church to join, he had been talking to Briggs and Gurley for some time. They were trying to get him to join their church. By this time, James had died already, and his church was not without leadership. They had some apostles left, but they were without a prophet. And since that church was very focused on having a prophet, and they had gathered a lot of people from Nauvoo, who rejected Brigham because Brigham was not a prophet, and he was leading the church as the quorum of the 12 apostles president. And so for a lot of people who joined James's church, they joined saying, a church without a prophet is not the prophet for me. And they left Brigham Young to join James because he was a prophet in the first presidency. This exodus from Nauvoo is one of the reasons, probably the biggest reason, that Brigham Young did an about-face and decided that he needed to be put into the first presidency role and make it official. And he did that in 1847. A lot of people kind of answer this period by saying, well, that was a practice. They had a 3-year waiting period for some later successions within that denomination, but they only did that just to validate Brigham Young's delay, and really nothing more than that. It's not a church law by any stretch. So James having died, left his group, who was pretty set on having a first president prophet, without a first president and prophet of the church. So they did have a few apostles But they weren't ordaining any new ones, and many of the Strangites believed that it was now a new apostasy setting in. So Joseph the Third officially joins the proto-RLDS church, and they officially form a church. And one of the reasons, the Strangites were reaching out to him as well and saying, come join us. But at this period, Brigham Young was having a controversy with Joseph's family, and also accusing Joseph Smith II, Jr., of practicing polygamy. And because it was coming out that Brigham was practicing it, and he was asserting that he got the practice directly from Joseph, he was pretty set on convincing everyone that he got it directly from Joseph and that it's a legitimate practice. Joseph's family didn't like this at all. They were very offended, and the church was also, the church had already lost 2 prophets, 3 if you count Joseph's brother, Hiram, and several others, Samuel as well. James was assassinated too. So they had received a lot of persecution. Many martyrs within the movement had died, and so things were tense. And a lot of people, that really settled it for a lot of people who didn't feel comfortable with polygamy anyway, and offending their, American sensibilities, Christian sensibilities, because it hadn't been practiced for so long in Christendom. And so, to distance themselves not only from polygamy, but from anybody that practiced it, that really influenced Joseph III in rejecting James as a prophet. They felt that they needed to just be done away with anybody who was practicing polygamy. However, not only did Joseph indicate that Joseph III might be a president of the church, but James also did in Revelation. So all of the Strangites were posed to accept Joseph III already. Brigham Young and his people too, which is why Brigham Young tried so hard to get Joseph III to move out to Utah and become a leader among them, because it would really solidify Brigham Young's leadership. And so Joseph III became anti-polygamy. So rather than join with the Strangites, he joined with the Strangite splinter group started by Briggs and Gurley, who formed on the basis of rejecting polygamy. So he joined with them. And when he did, most of the remaining Strangites also joined the RLDS Church, and they officially became the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in, I believe, 1860-ish. And when this happened, now, one of the things we don't need to assume is that those who joined immediately gave up James Strang and their beliefs. They were kind of torn between believing in James and believing in that Joseph III was going to be the next prophet, which James had also indicated. And they had received all this persecution too. So there was a lot of debates in the early RLDS church whether they were going to accept a Saturday Sabbath like the Strangites, or a Sunday Sabbath, which is what they were practicing under Joseph Smith, a holdover from apostate Christendom. So they had those debates. They were very, divided on, and they settled on that they would have a Sunday Sabbath. And they also settled on polygamy being wrong, and that was very well contested among them. And that they would reject James and his scriptures and call his 12-year ministry and beyond a disorganized period, which is where they get the name Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That did not convince everybody. And there were a lot of people who still, even though they were putting their support behind the new prophet, Joseph III, still maintained their beliefs. And James's last apostle was one of those. He was very adamant at getting his people to join and support Joseph III. And even though he was fully supporting Joseph III, he would not give up his belief in James. Being somebody of influence and continuing to talk about James and preach what James had taught, he ran into difficulties with the church and was excommunicated himself. So the RLDS church really got started from people who broke off from James Strang and really picked up its steam when it took most of the Strangites in who were really without leadership. Now, in this period, the Hedrickites, the Temple Lot Church, they kind of formed. I just drew a circle underneath this line from Joseph because they didn't really break off from either the Brighamites or the Whitmerites or the RLDS, but they had been maintaining, kind of gathering some stakes who had not decided on any of these leaders, and they were holding down the fort until Granville Hedrick, and he was. At this time, about 1863, he became a prophet and president of the church. And later, he distanced from the title, but he led as the president of the 12 apostles. And so his church continues. Brigham Young's church continues. Over this course of this history, they picked up a lot of steam, and they practically became synonymous with the term Mormon, but it was far from that at first. Now, there was the Temple Lot case between the Temple Lots, the RLDS, and the Brighamites got involved, and they were bringing all sorts of claims together, trying to see who's the authentic church. The Temple Lot Church, I believe, got recognition from the courts as being the most authentic at that time, and Brigham Young was unsuccessful at convincing the court that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. They ruled that he was not. So there you have that. But all of these lines continue to the present with various numbers in each one, and so there are a lot of different groups that all have a legitimate claim to being a Mormon or part of Joseph Smith's church and history, and they broke off at different times. Many of them never broke off from Brigham Young. It should be noted that Brigham Young himself was excommunicated by James Strang in a legal, according to church policy, excommunication trial. Now, Brigham claims to have excommunicated James as well. They recorded that, but they never did hold a trial and never invited him to defend himself, so that would be invalid according to church policy. And so to pick any one of these and allow these people to speak for the whole group would be unfair to all the others. And like I said, there's many groups here with their legitimate claims in their own way, their own tradition, and they should not be marginalized. We should not group them all together or let any of them, which is so often done, presidents or leaders from the largest will make a claim, and anti-Mormons or opponents of Mormonism will pretend that claim speaks for everybody, or that if they can cast doubt on those decisions, they have somehow cast doubt on the founder, and that would not be accurate at all. So yeah, this is just a very small overview of all these different groups.